Good evening and welcome. My name's Lou Kaplan, and I'm Secretary of the S.A.V.E. Board. And on behalf of the Board of Directors of S.A.V.E., I want to welcome you to our 2019 Invited Speaker event. This year, we are partnering with the Delaware Valley Smart Growth Alliance, and we're very pleased to be working with them. And I want to acknowledge Brian O'Leary, who's here this evening as a member of that organization's board, and he's also here in his capacity as the Executive Director of the Chester County Planning Commission. I also want to acknowledge the effort that Blair Fleischman has put into this event this evening. It couldn't have happened without her. So tonight's focus on urban revitalization is a bit of a departure for S.A.V.E. with our focus on rural conservation in southeastern Chester County. But we're doing this in part because we recognize the critical role of strong cities, strong urban areas, and I'll include within that definition towns and boroughs, the role that they play in the conservation efforts that we have undertaken and others have undertaken in southern Chester County. I'm going to begin this evening with some news events from S.A.V.E. for activities that we've been involved with, and I'll start with Route 41. I'm very excited to say that there is a design for a roundabout at 926 and Route 41. And this design has gone through PennDOT review. It has been critiqued and modified by Mark Johnson, who was hired by the supervisors in Londonderry Township. Some of you may remember Mark, who was one of our featured speakers some years ago. He's probably the leading expert on roundabout design. And they hope to have a final design for that roundabout prepared in June. So this is very exciting that that's actually moving forward. The situation in Chatham is more complex and is moving more slowly. So the intersection of 841 and 41, as any of you who travel that roadway know, has gateway features, which are helpful, but they're not the ultimate solution. And PennDOT has on its website and has presented to the public 6 different alternatives for the intersection improvement. The next step in the process is a historical review or review of the impacts on historic properties. And the Federal Highway Administration has said to PennDOT, you cannot go through that process with 6 alternatives. You need to whittle that down to 1 or 2 alternatives before going through that. So PennDOT will be having a public meeting in London Grove Township, hopefully before the summer, to get public input on those 6 alternatives to try to bring them down. S.A.V.E. has also been following and hoping to keep people apprised of the issues with the Chester Water Authority and the attempts by Aqua America to purchase the authority. The authority has been working with the City of Chester. City of Chester has financial issues, and the authority and the City of Chester have come to an agreement that would allow the control to remain with the authority and provide some income to the City of Chester. When that agreement was announced, Aqua America sued, and That suit is moving forward, though the hearing that had been scheduled for tomorrow in the Delaware County Common Pleas Court has been postponed. So if you stay apprised with our website or Chester Water Authority's website, you can get some information on that issue moving forward. S.A.V.E has also been very involved in working to provide input to the county for their comprehensive plan, Landscapes 3. And this evening, we're honored to have with us a guest speaker, Sonia, Hunsinger, did I get that right? Who has been working with the city as an administrator with the city of Coatesville, and is here representing Coatesville Second Century Alliance. And her comments will help put into context the larger issue of urban revitalization. So we're going to begin this evening with some brief remarks from Sonia, and please help me welcome her.
Thank you for the opportunity to say a few words to you this evening. I appreciate the invitation, Blair. Blair asked me to talk a little bit about how my position came into being and the Second Century Alliance formation. Excuse me. So the Second Century Alliance began back in 2015 when the city of Coatesville celebrated its 100th anniversary as a third-class city. 18 community stakeholders came together and wanted to make sure that Coatesville's second century was economically prosperous. At the same time, Chester County was working on its long-range planning, its open space preservation, and its focus on its urban centers. And so the county came together with those 18 community stakeholders in the Second Century Alliance and created a full-time position focused on community and economic development in the city of Coatesville. That's me. So in 2016, I started with the Second Century Alliance. The partnership is a true public-private partnership in that the county, I am technically a county employee. I work for the Department of Community Development. My salary is half supported by the county commissioners. My benefits are covered by the county commissioners. But the other half of my salary and the operations for the organization are covered by private funds raised from our board. So fast forward a year to 2017, when we were able to go after a grant through the Wells Fargo Regional Foundation in partnership with the Chester County Economic Development Council. And we were able to secure a 5-year commitment from the foundation to hire a community coordinator who is focused solely on our residential neighborhoods. So the Second Century Alliance didn't have the capacity to have staff, and so once again the county steps up and partners with the Second Century Alliance and the private sector to support that position as the employer of record. So the county is supporting that position through benefits and being the technical employer of that position, while the grant pays for that position's full-time salary. Fast forward another year, and we were able to secure a neighborhood partnership program grant through the Department of Economic Development at the state, and we are now able to bring on a full-time downtown manager. Once again, the county's stepping up and going to be the employer of record for that position. They're going to cover the benefits, and the grant will cover the full-time salary of that position. So the Second Century Alliance has now positioned itself as the partner to the city administration in community and economic development, and we see ourselves at full complement now. We have a community coordinator focused solely on the residential neighborhoods. We'll have a downtown manager focused on our commercial corridor, and then I'll be working on the broader jobs and economic opportunity and economic development piece. So that's kind of, I think that's what you wanted me to touch on, the partnership that the county has, the public-private partnership. Okay? And I'll be here afterwards if anybody has any questions. And our strategic plan is on the table. Thank you.
So our featured speaker this evening is Tom Murphy. Tom is a fellow at the Urban Land Institute. And I learned this evening that some of his early passions were biology and continuing passion in farming, but he got swept away by politics, and he served for 3 terms as the mayor of Pittsburgh. And in that position, he initiated a public-private partnership that brought more than $4.5 billion of economic investment into that city. Prior to being the mayor of Pittsburgh, Tom was an 8-term member of the Pennsylvania legislature as a representative. So we're really honored to have Tom with us this evening, and I hope you will help me welcome him.
How am I going to do this?
I think he would like you to use this mic.
I can just take it? Okay. I got to push the buttons.
Okay.
Hello. We're figuring out the logistics. Can you all hear me? Yes. Okay. Tell me what button I'm pushing here. The one all the way on the left? Okay. Am I blocking you here? I'm delighted to be here. Why do you have somebody from Pittsburgh here who is a mayor of a city? And I know why, though, because what you're facing here is challenges that every city in America, and in fact the world, is facing. Okay. And in my view, I've had an opportunity to be mayor of a city, but with the...
I don't think your mic is on.
Is it off?
Now.
Can you all hear me? Yes. I'm going to do... you have it on? Okay. Is it on now? No. I don't need to hold it. Here.
Okay.
Let me do it with... Okay. So I'll try without it, okay? This title is Intentionality because what I've come to realize, both being a mayor of a city and having now visited over 100 cities since I've been with the Urban Land Institute over the last few years, I've come to realize that things don't happen by accident. Great places happen because people are very intentional about it. Whether you're trying to protect the land here, great cities, all are about intentionality, about how the choices that a community makes now that will have huge impact in the future. And now particularly those in choices are very important because fundamentally the rules are getting turned upside down. The rules that we have based our decisions on through the 50s and 60s and the 70s, the 80s and 90s in cities have changed dramatically. You know, back even 20 years ago, it was very unusual to have lots of people living in a city. Now cities can't build houses fast enough. Cities were 9 to 5 kind of places. Then everybody looked at the suburbs. That's changing, but where we buy things and where things are made fundamentally has changed completely. And it's had huge impact, both positive and negative, on most communities around the world. Environmental issues, how we build and where we build. Whether you believe in climate change or not, get over it. It is beginning to have huge impact on choices that we're making. Communities are making decisions. In Pittsburgh, for example, we have a floodplain management plan that basically says in certain areas you can't build anymore. If you're going to build, you're going to build very high because you're in a floodplain and you need to be careful. And that's happening along the coast in many communities from Miami to the California coast, making choices about where people will build. We are watching it with technological innovation. Look at what you're carrying. You're carrying a computer around in your pocket. It's fundamentally changing how we do business and where we do business. And demographics, which I'll talk about a little bit later, is fundamentally redefining communities, as does how cities make choices about what they want to build. I understand S.A.V.E. started dealing with a highway bypass. That's a choice communities make. You want to spend that money on building a new highway, or you want to make it invested in something else. There are the choices that communities are making, and increasingly highways are not seen as the best investment. And I'll talk a little bit about that moving forward. And finally, the competition in the world about employment, about where people want to work, it's about attracting talent. And that talent gets attracted by two things. It gets attracted by the quality of place, and it gets attracted by the kind of jobs that you're creating. And how and where that talent is going, and we'll talk about that a little bit more because it has a huge impact. So what do cities need to succeed? They need to know where they want to go and how they want to. So vision becomes a very important choice, a strategic vision. They need to have some land control. If the city, particularly a city like Pittsburgh that was depressed, it was hard to get developers to come in. And if the land wasn't available and they needed to negotiate with the land, it was much easier to go out and buy 100 acres out in the suburbs in a green field and build on that, rather than it was to deal with an old steel mill or other issues. And public-private partnerships. I'm not a believer in government solving these problems. I'm a believer in government being a partner with the private market. And so the private market dictates really the drivers of this and how government encourages the private market to take risk. And where does money come from? Imagine, and I'll talk about this, is Pittsburgh was a flat broke city. I go to lots of cities and they say, we'd love to do this stuff, but we don't have any money. And I say, you're lying, you have money. There's ways to get money for cities, and cities are spending, they have budgets. Pittsburgh's budget was $400 million a year. We had money. We were making choices about where we wanted to invest that money. And one of the big choices cities face, do you spend all the money on today? And there's a huge demands to spend it on a day. Every city will say they need more police, and you got to get snow off the road and fix the potholes. But at the other hand, the most important investment you can make is in tomorrow. Is how you investing to position your city to compete in a world that's changing. Where does those resources come from? They're competing with today, but you need to make that choice to take some of those resources. That's a hard decision sometimes, and we'll talk about it. And finally, who's leading it? You know, I've found that people love process, particularly elected officials, because it's a safe place to be. Well, we'll study it. We'll set up a task force to look at it. And there's nothing wrong with that, but so often it continues on and there's not a decision made. And I think that is where the leadership comes in, is that you got to listen, but at some point you say, we're moving forward, and you're going to make some people happy, some people angry, and there are the choices. If you're not willing to make that choice, if you want to be loved by everybody, then that's part of the challenge of how you move forward to do what you want to get. So there are cities all over America that are reinventing themselves, and I'm not going to talk about all these cities, but you've heard of some of them and some of you might not have heard. All these cities have made really intentional decisions about what they want to be when they grow up in the 21st century. And they've made remarkable kind of decisions, and let me just touch on a couple of them. But let me go to the demographics first. So people that look like, how many of you belong to AARP? Go ahead, give it up. If you belong to AARP, most of you don't look like you should, right? If you belong to AARP, you know that they put out a great magazine every month, and pretty much every other month or so there's an article about where do boomers want to live. And you know what? The characteristics of those boomer places that people want to live, it's walkable, it's affordable, it has great culture and the arts, it has great recreation, and that's the kind of community, that's a series of choices a community makes about whether they can build that kind of community. Even more dramatically are our kids. or our grandkids that are the millennials. There's 83 million of them. They're the biggest bubble in the demographic. The average 24-year-old is 6 times less likely to own an automobile at 24 than their parents were at that age. This is a General Motors survey. What does that tell you? Because it's a dramatic decision. It has huge implications. It says that they don't care about that 57 Chevy, that fancy car. They're interested in mobility and how they move to a job. And ideally, they would like to walk. And so there's a Google company, and Google has a research facility in Pittsburgh with about 600 or 700 people in what was formerly a very sketchy neighborhood in Pittsburgh. And 60% of their workforce either walks or rides bikes to work. Are you building communities like that? Because that's where talent wants to go. They want communities that they can get very good mobility, whether it's transit or Uber or riding a bike or walking. They want to be able to go to the bars and restaurants and have a kind of life that they don't have to drive for an hour and a half. And that's how communities need to think about shaping themselves, because that becomes a very important piece. And so I mentioned the vision. How many of you have seen the High Line in New York City? Pretty remarkable, isn't it? If you go to New York City, make sure you go see it. It's one of the most visited things in New York. And it was an old railroad trestle that for the last 40 years was an abandoned railroad trestle 30 feet in the air running down the west side of Manhattan. And it was just vacant. It was sitting there, and Mayor Bloomberg called a meeting to announce they were going to tear it down. And a group of young people who have no particular positions in government or anything say, you don't want to tear that down. We go up there and hang out and smoke pot probably, and it's a great place. It's a great place. It's a whole different view of New York City. It's like a big garden. And so Mayor Bloomberg went up with them, so did some other people, and they decided to I don't know if he smoked the pot or not, and he made a decision. He said, we ought to keep this. We ought to listen to these kids. And if you go there today, it's this incredible walk that runs, I don't know, about 20 blocks. It runs into what is called the Hudson Yards, which is the largest development in the world happening right now. And Hudson Yards, which is a $60 billion development over top of a railroad yard, describes themselves as we are located at the end of the High Line. An old railroad trestle that people saw as a liability, now it has created billions of dollars of real estate development there. That happened because people were willing to take a risk. It happened because people had a vision of something that was seen as an absolute liability, turned it into something that was really valuable. And land control. Denver is a great, how many of you have been to Denver? You know that Denver, and this really touches exactly on what you're talking about. In 2006, the citizens of Denver and 7 counties around Denver voted to raise taxes on themselves to build a 120-mile transit system. And one of the big motivations to build that transit system is the very reason people love Denver and around Denver, the Front Range. They were losing that to sprawl and pollution. And they didn't want that sprawl, and so they built this transit system. If you've been there, you know in downtown Denver, it's created a huge development around an old railroad station, but there are 78 stops on this transit system now, and around that transit system, instead of people sprawling out, they are doing transit-oriented development, some density around those, and so they're capturing a lot of what would have been the sprawling growth around Denver. They're keeping it much more dense around these transit stops. It's a pretty remarkable development. And this is one of my favorite places. How many of you have been to Greenville, South Carolina? Isn't it an amazing city? So Greenville, South Carolina was nowhere. It was a dead place. 20 years ago, the State Highway Department, this might resonate with you, built a 4-lane road. They built that bridge, a 4-lane bridge, over top of this waterfall, and they ran the four lanes right through the middle of Greenville. They narrowed the sidewalks, they eliminated the parking lanes, and there was a 4-lane. And the mayor 20 years ago said this bridge is buried, this beautiful waterfall, which you can see in this picture. It's buried, that highway went right over that waterfall, which is right in downtown Greenville. And buried that, and there's all the buildings along Main Street are vacant because nobody can park there, and there's the highway and there's the traffic going through. So the mayor said, I want to tear that bridge down. And you know what? People said, how are we going to get through Greenville? And he said, that's the point. I don't want you to go through Greenville. So they tore the bridge down, and they narrowed the 4-lane road running through the middle of the city to one way each way and parking, and they widened the sidewalks. If you go to downtown Greenville today, it is the jumpingest place. They built a performance arts center. BMW decided to locate their U.S. headquarters in Greenville because they love the city. This is not a big city. It's about 100,000 people. It's a small town, but it's a great place that they made a series of choices, right, that weren't popular, but ended up working really, really well. Tampa Bay, I don't know how many have been to Tampa. It's a pretty remarkable city. It was dead during the financial crisis. And they had a really good mayor, Bob Buckhorn, who really began to make some serious decisions. So this was an old creek that was it was buried in a culvert, and it was basically a sewer that was pulling out into the river there, and there was nothing there, and those buildings were vacant. And over the last 5 years, the city cleaned that up, opened it up, daylighted the stream. I was there for dinner. There are restaurants, there are offices. All those buildings you see there were vacant or now occupied, and they used the stream that they daylighted as really one of the emphasis to create this sense of place. I was there, and it was fish in the water, and it was birds flying around, and that was an old sort of garbage dump and sewer outlet, really, that they converted into this really pretty remarkable place. And one of the best stories, I think, in America right now is in Cincinnati. And I want to talk to you a little bit about this because you're part of this conversation. So Cincinnati was failing. Downtown Cincinnati, headquarters of Procter & Gamble and Kroger's, was sort of a 9-to-5 kind of city. This is just 10 years ago. Right adjacent to downtown Cincinnati, literally across the street from the headquarters of Kroger's, was a neighborhood called Over the Rhine, which was described as the worst neighborhood in America. It had had racial riots in the late 90s. It was largely vacant, had spectacular architecture, as you can see, but nothing was happening. The business leadership, not the political leadership, the business leadership came together, created a nonprofit organization called 3CDC. You can look it up. They hired my development director. I was leaving as mayor. They hired him, and they committed $50 million into a development fund. And if you go there today, you will see and the first thing Steve did, who was the director, been director for 10 years, has bought over 500 buildings. Give you a sense of how Over the Rhine was, as well as some downtown buildings. If you go there today, you'll see almost $3 billion worth of new investment over a 10-year period. It's pretty remarkable. He has been able to build take these units, a lot of new retail and residential. He also financed 3 homeless shelters, some affordable housing, hotels downtown. It's a remarkable story of not the political leadership, but the private leadership making the decision, a series of very intentional decisions and choices about the kind of city they wanted to have. And it has been very successful in doing that. Erie, which is at the other side of the state, right? Erie lost their largest employer. 20,000 people work for General Electric Locomotive there. And they have largely shut it down. There's about less than 1,000 people left there. Erie's population has declined to 86,000 people. And they made a decision to invest. It led by Erie Insurance. It's headquartered there. They made a personal commitment to build a new office building right downtown. And they, much like Cincinnati, created a private Erie Economic Development Corporation partnering with the city and they've raised $30 million in a small town to invest in partnership with private developers in revitalizing downtown Erie. Stay tuned because it's just started. It will be a remarkable success story for a small city to do something like that. And that brings me to Pittsburgh. So Pittsburgh was, as you know, the steel center of America. 60% of the steel made in America during World War II was made in the Pittsburgh area. It defined who we were. My father worked in a steel mill for 51 years. I grew up in that whole culture. And all my uncles and everybody worked in that steel mill. And it was what defined us. Everybody worked at 60% of the population worked in heavy manufacturing. And the steel mills closed. And so between 1970 and 1995, we lost from our region 400,000 people left the Pittsburgh region. Didn't just move from the city to the suburbs. They moved to Houston and Florida and other places and the people that were leaving were young people. So we became the second oldest county in America, other than Dade County, which is Miami, we weren't becoming old because people were retiring. We were becoming old because our young people were leaving. In fact, there were billboards up in Pittsburgh that said, "The last person out, shut the lights off." In the mid-'80s, we were losing as many as 50,000 people in a year. I want you to think about that because it has huge tragic consequences as families are split up and have generations of people that worked in the steel mill. And then those jobs disappeared. The city itself lost 60% of its population. So by 1995, in a city that 30 years earlier had 620,000 people, we now had 300,000 people. And we were on our way downhill. Our unemployment rate was 22%, so we were essentially at a depression-era unemployment rate. And we had thousands of acres of these. This is the mill my father worked in and for 51 years. And so we made a fundamental decision in 1994 when I was becoming mayor, is that we were going to sort of pursue a no guts, no glory, take no prisoners kind of approach, is that we needed to fundamentally change how we thought about Pittsburgh and we needed to reimagine a different city. And one of those challenges was that we had thousands of acres of bankrupt and vacant steel mills. And they were a reminder to all of us of our decline. And so we made a decision to buy them. So in the first 18 months that I was mayor, we bought 1,500 acres of property. We bought whole steel mills, many of them untested environmentally. We basically said we can look at them and screw around with them for the next 30 years about environmental issues, or we can just go ahead and buy them and take the risk of getting them cleaned up. And thank goodness the steel industry, by and large, other than coke ovens, are generally not very polluting. And so we didn't. Bigger problem was the foundations when we were talking. So where my father worked with 10,000 men and women, there's now a cheesecake factory. He would shoot me if he were alive. There's $800 million worth of development on that steel mill site. That's it. And it's $800 million now. We put about $150 million of public money in that. We built parking garages. When we buy that and we clean it up, the first people wanting to develop are Walmart. And we make a decision we don't want to do big box with 20 acres of parking development. We want to do a very urban development. And so that the left-hand side of that is all residential, the middle part is retail, and the part on the right is largely technology-oriented buildings. Now, I'm not going to tell you that there were lots of developers lined up. We're losing our population. We're essentially a flat broke city. You're going to ask me where we got the money. I'll talk about that. We're a flat broke city, and yet, so we partnered with developers and we shared the risk. Nobody knew whether anybody would live there because we were losing all of our population. It was the best residential development of any that this developer had done. He had largely just done suburban development and outperformed always suburban developments. This has been a very successful development. We didn't, so when the residential people came or the retail people came or the technology developers came, they said, you know, we will build this building, but we can't afford to build a structured parking. You know, we need surface parkings. So we financed and built 4 parking garages because we wanted that density. That we could, rather than having one building with a lot of acres of parking, we financed that, that building. And this is the old Nabisco Bakery that was located in a neighborhood. If you know Pittsburgh, it's called East Liberty. If you know, East Liberty was a failed urban renewal area. 60% of the property in East Liberty was tax delinquent. When we buy the old Sears building, there's a Sears building there vacant for about 15 years, 20 acres right in the middle of East Liberty. Let me describe. East Liberty is in the middle of the 2 poorest neighborhoods of Pittsburgh and the 2 richest neighborhoods of Pittsburgh. And we make a decision that we want to try to turn that neighborhood around. As you can imagine, there was a long way to go with 60% of the property tax delinquent. So we buy it and we look at each other and say, what are we going to do with the old Sears building? And we decide the best thing we could do was to bring a Home Depot. And why? Because rich people and poor people would shop at Home Depot, and the closest one was way out in the suburbs, 10 miles away. And so we called up the Home Depot people and said, we'd love to talk to you about putting a store. And they laughed at us and said, we're never going to put a store there. It's 5 miles from the nearest interstate. It's in the middle of a blighted area. We're not interested in doing that. And so this is a true story. I called up the mayor of Atlanta. I said, tell me about the 2 guys that own Home Depot. And he told me particularly about Bernie Marcus. Bernie Marcus, he said, is very philanthropic in Atlanta, and he's also very active in national Jewish affairs. And so we called up my friends in the Jewish community and said, could you invite Bernie Marcus to Pittsburgh to speak at a dinner? And Bernie Marcus came to the dinner a couple months later, and another friend hosted him at a reception. I had a bodyguard then, and my bodyguard walked up to Bernie Marcus and showed him his gun and said, we're kidnapping you. This is a true story. And Bernie Marcus said, are you crazy? No, he said, you can make our dreams come true if you come with us for a half hour. And so we put him in a car, and he agreed to do it, and we took him over to show him the Home Depot site, or the old Sears building, which with 60% of the property around it, all tax delinquent and vacant. And we said, we want you to think about putting a store here. And he said, that'd be a hard sell, but let me think about it. And at the end of the evening, he came up and said, we'll do it. We'll take a risk with you. We'll put a store there. And it was the first major urban retail store Home Depot ever did. From the day it opened until a week ago when I was there, it has been the highest sales volume store in the Pittsburgh market. So then a young developer comes to us and said, you know, I think if you work with me, I can get us in front of Whole Foods. There's no Whole Foods in the Pittsburgh market at the time. And so he had an option on an old warehouse. We worked with this developer, and we get in front of Whole Foods in Austin, and Whole Foods said, okay, we'll take a risk with you. We'll put a Whole Foods there. It was the Rookie of the Year store. And it had the highest sales volume per square foot of any store in the country, and it also had the highest percentage of food stamps being used. And so that led to Target. It led to hundreds of new units of houses. And then in the middle of East Liberty is this big old, just a couple blocks from Home Depot, is this big old Nabisco bakery, 8 stories, been vacant for 15 years. Google was at the same time as growing over at CMU, starting with 2 people. They kept growing in their research. They start looking around, and guess where they go? They go in this old Nabisco bakery. So what's the relationship between Home Depot and Nabisco? Nabisco or Google doesn't go there if Home Depot doesn't give people in Whole Foods confidence that they can come to East Liberty. So we watch that kind of connection happen, and that's the old Google building. There's hundreds of millions of dollars of development around it where Google is now, called Bakery Square. If you come to Pittsburgh, you will see an incredible, and it's a good example of a great public-private partnership. And what is driving Pittsburgh's economy now is technology, and particularly Carnegie Mellon University, which we are watching hundreds of companies spin out of Carnegie Mellon, and the Carnegie Mellon is right now the leader in artificial intelligence. So if you come to Pittsburgh, you will see up to 200 driverless cars on the street of Pittsburgh. Are you ready for that? No. So I've had 2 aha moments. I was riding a bike last summer. and I came to an intersection just as the Uber driverless car came to the intersection. And I felt like I was in the woods, and I'd come around the corner and I was looking at a bear. And we were trying to decide what we were going to do. And so it was the same thing. I looked at this car, and the hair went up and back of my neck because I realized for the first time in my life, I was looking at a machine and it was looking at me. And we were together going to make a decision. Okay, and it waited, and I went across the street in front of it. And then not a week or two later, I was jaywalking, and I was walking across between two cars. There were no cars coming this way, and there were 3 cars coming that way. And of course, you would wait for these 3 cars to go by. And I wasn't paying much attention. I just stopped in the street and waited for these 3 cars to go by. And the first car stopped dead. And I looked at it, and it was an Uber driverless car. Now, if it was a human driving that, they would have kept going, right? The two cars that behind them almost hit him because he didn't expect them to stop, right? And so it's sort of remarkable to watch this play out. You can tell who they are because they have this thing going around on the roof of the car that's doing 1,500 calculations a second. It's looking at things, and then that information is getting processed and made into decisions, whether to stop or to go or to turn or what's the speed limit. And so it's a pretty remarkable thing that we are living with right now. And so part of what Pittsburgh has done in partnership with a lot of private companies, universities, to build a lot of makerspace. Part of what is fun now in the world is that a lot of people, both old and young, are thinking about starting their own companies, whether it's a dressmaker or a computer company, and you want to create spaces where that can happen, and they are making choices. And then we had downtown that was failing. Some of you know Pittsburgh. You know we have the 3 rivers across the river. I'll talk about them in a little while, the ballparks. That rectangle area there is our cultural trust district. It was our red light district. There were 22 massage parlors and strip joints located in that 3-block by 5-block area, 7-block area. The city did not provide the leadership. The foundation community, particularly the Heinz Endowment, provided the leadership that said we can convert that into a cultural district. And I was a doubting Thomas, I would admit that, and others were. But now the symphony, the ballet, the opera, theaters are all there. There are 2 million people a year coming into that area for culture and the arts. There's 1,500 performances. It's a pretty remarkable, lots of restaurants, lots of new housing up in the older buildings above them. It really is a great example of how culture and the arts can be an economic driver, particularly if you bundle them into enough activity that it's not one night a week, but it's 2 or 3 activities in a night. And there's some of the places in the Cultural Trust District. We were partners. We had our rivers. They were polluted. When I was growing up in Pittsburgh, my mother would always say 2 things to me: be home before the streetlights come on and never go near the rivers. She'd say, if you go in those rivers, you're going to melt. Because they were really polluted, and occasionally they would catch on fire. And long before I became mayor, there was a whole effort to begin to clean up the rivers. And now we have this remarkable waterfront that is pretty much all public park, lots of kayaking, canoeing, and occasion even swimming in our rivers, which was not something you ever even thought about. And then how many of you are planners and architects? So what were you all smoking and drinking in the 60s and 70s? I want you to look at this picture. This Three Rivers Stadium opened in 1970, right? It's right across the river from downtown Pittsburgh. The highest and best use was 30 acres of parking. And notice the road on the river, there was not even a trail on the river. And so the Steelers lost the Super Bowl, so we blew it up. And we built a new football stadium and a new baseball park that by everybody's measure says it's the best baseball park in America, and right on the river. And we built a new convention center. At the time, it was the largest certified green building in America that we built. And that's that riverfront. Now there's $1.5 billion of development between those stadiums. So we built parking garages. The teams they wanted surface parking, but we said, you're not going to get it. We want to develop this property. And so we capture the parking revenue Instead of giving it to the teams and we use it to build parking garages, we'll build 3 now, and as we take out the surface parking, we build the garages. And so there's now $1.5 billion. There's office buildings, there's bars and restaurants. There's going to be some housing there. You have to be 25 years old to want to live between a baseball park and a football stadium, but that's going to happen. And one of the other things, and probably what I'm proudest of, is that when I became mayor, we had less than a mile of riverfront access for people. We thought of the rivers as something you would go across. There were old railroads and steel mills and junkyards and all kinds of stuff on the rivers, and we really made a focused decision to capture our waterfronts. And so now there's about 28 miles of riverfront, continuous riverfront park. And in fact, if any of you are bike riders, I think the best bike ride in America right now is from right in downtown Pittsburgh all the way to Washington, D.C. 345 miles. You don't have to go on a road. It's all a continuous bike trail the whole way. It's pretty spectacular if you're into riding bikes. And that didn't happen. That was a very thoughtful decision on part a whole group of other people. Again, a series of choices of probably over 100 communities making a decision about that they wanted to imagine themselves in a different kind of way. And so in Somerset County, little towns like Myersville and everything, their whole economy has been transformed. These are failing old small town coal mine towns are now been transformed by this trail. There's bed and breakfasts, there are restaurants, and thousands of people are riding this trail recreationally. So you're going to say, we'd love to do all this stuff, we don't have the money. Every city has money. It's a series of choices. So I want you to think Pittsburgh lost 60% of its population. Our bond rating was junk bond status. But we made a hard decision. The first thing we made a decision on is that we were going to take $6 million out of our operating budget. My budget director was screaming. We reduced the city's workforce, including the police force. And we took $6 million out of our operating budget and financed a $60 million development fund. So we didn't want to wait for the state. We didn't want to wait for the federal governments to help us. We wanted to have our ability to lift ourselves up by our own bootstraps. So we made a really hard decision. When I ran for re-election 4 years later, my opponent's whole campaign was pictures of old steel mills saying, the mayor wasted our money buying all these old steel mills when we could have hired more police. That's a choice we made. Our crime rate, by the way, went down. Even as our police force went down. So that was the good news. So we made a series of decisions about doing that, about how to do tax increment financing, about how to use other funds. There's a new tool now called opportunity zones. So how you put those together. So that South Side Works, that steel mill site that we developed, there's probably 10 or 12 different sources of financing in that deal. And our attitude was that if it made sense, we were going to partner with the developers. So developers would come to us and say, hey, Mayor, I have a great idea for you, and we'd say, with all due respect, tell us why it's a great idea for you, and we'll decide whether it's a great idea for us. And if our self-interests come together, we'll share the risk with you to try to make it work. That assumed we knew what we wanted, like in Home Depot and in other developments that we did. And every city needs to do that. And so what does McDonald's and GE and Marriott and Motorola and Kraft Foods and all these other companies have in common? This is important. They've all, in the last 3 years, moved their headquarters in research from suburban locations into cities. So General Electric moves thousands of jobs from a very nice suburban campus in Connecticut into downtown Boston. McDonald's moves from a very nice suburban campus in Chicago into downtown Chicago. I mean, thousands of jobs we're talking about. Marriott moves their headquarters out of an office park out in suburban Washington into a small city near Washington called Bethesda, but it's a walkable, if you know Bethesda, it's a very walkable urban They moved from an office park where if you wanted to go buy a Diet Coke, you either used the vending machine or you got in your car. And they wanted to be in a walkable, livable kind of place where both boomers and kids want to live. And so all these companies have moved their headquarters. They could move to Coatesville. because that's the kind of, Bethesda could be like Coatesville. It's a small town. They could move the places. They want to have places that have a quality of life and have opportunities for young people. So I talked about placemaking. If you know Pittsburgh, this is right in front of the Cathedral of Learning, which is the entrance to the University of Pittsburgh. And so right across the street from that, my daughter took that picture from her office in the Cathedral of Learning. Right behind it is a spectacular urban park called Shinley Park. And what did we think was the highest and best use of that property? 600 surface parking lots. So the chancellor and I got together and said, this is a terrible entrance to Oakland, to the university, to our park. Let's get rid of the parking. And instead, we took the parking out and we built a new park. And of course, I got 600 hate mail, 600 letters from people saying, I'm never voting for you again, you took away my parking space. And I said, you'll get over it, you'll figure it out. But this park becomes this great lawn for the University of Pittsburgh, for people going to the park, for people going to the museum. It becomes a great entrance. One of the corporations funded a merry-go-round. There's a good little restaurant there. On a nice summer day, it is the greatest place to be, packed with people. It's a choice that we made. For years, we just said, it'll do. It was going to be a parking lot. So we made one of the other things we did, and this is 1993, when we're going down, we're losing population. We make a decision as a county to raise our sales tax 0.5% to fund our regional assets. So the libraries get the most. We get about $80 to $100 million a year. The libraries get the most. The parks get the second most. Cultural institutions, so the zoo, the aviary, the Phipps Conservatory, if you know any of those places, they all get funded out of this. So we make a decision in the place of an economic crisis that these assets are really important to protect, and that we as a community are going to invest in them. And I think you've done some of that, and that's part of why this discussion, why you're here and why you exist. And so I mentioned about the development fund. That's how we did many TIF financing. ULI puts a book out about how to finance. And so I'm going to just simply end. You need to know where you're going. You need to have great leadership that are willing to take risk. You need to have strong partnerships and how you build those. And I believe you need money on the public side to be part of a good partnership. And you need to understand you're trying to grow and attract talent. That's about place and jobs. And finally, if you're going to build anything, build something great. Don't do a sort of it'll do mediocre kind of thing. So that's the choices. Cities are making these choices all over the world. And the ones that are making the right choices, that are taking risks, are succeeding. Those that are sort of trying to protect the status quo or letting things happen without thinking about it, and I know that's a large part where you're struggling, particularly development. People love places to death and end up ruining the very reasons they want to be there because of the congestion and everything that follows. So I would implore you, you're doing God's work, both of your organizations. I would implore you to keep doing that, because that balance about keeping open spacing and development becomes a very important part of, I think, a competitive advantage of a region. So with that, if you have any questions, I'll be glad to try to answer them. Yeah, anybody have any questions? Yeah.
Were any of these big corporations that moved to Pittsburgh enticed with tax abatements of any sort?
No, I don't like tax abatements. I think tax abatements by right, you're giving people money whether they need it or not. I want to negotiate with you, if you understand what I mean. So I don't like, after I left as mayor, the city did some tax abatements in downtown. I think that you want to negotiate a deal, not get a tax abatement by right. So often what we would do in a development, you know, the first one in the water that was taking a risk because we didn't know what the market was, we would provide a pretty hefty subsidy. The second developer who came and said, you know, after that first developer made the investments, the second developer who came and said, I'd like to do what they did, but I'd like the same deal, and we would say that deal doesn't exist anymore. So we were very market driven. We were trying to understand, this developer was coming And the developer would say, you know, I'll build some housing here, but I don't think I can get more than $800 a month rent. And it's going to cost me $1,000 to build it. And so we might take the risk on that first $200 and then say to the developer, if you sell it, if you rent this apartment for more than $800 or $1,000, then you start paying us back. So we would share that risk with the developer to get that developer in the market. The second one, if that really worked, that development, housing development, the second one might not get any subsidy. So it was a very market-driven kind of approach. Tax abatements are not market-driven, if you understand what I mean. They are by right, I'm investing in this area, whether I need it or not, I'm going to get that tax abatement. And particularly for the ones later on when the market's now proven, I don't believe in that at all. Other questions? Yeah.
In southern Chester County, we have Coatesville, but we also have a lot of smaller municipalities.
Right.
So how do the ideas you presented sort of scale down when you get down to municipalities that have 5,000 people or 10,000?
It's funny you mention that because Allegheny County has more local governments than any county in the country. So Pittsburgh is 300,000 people in a county of 1.2 million people, and we have 132 local governments in Allegheny County. That means 132 mayors or township commissioners, 132 police chiefs. In our metropolitan area, 9 counties, we have 523 local governments. So you think you got a headache. And so our metropolitan planning, we had 9 counties in the city. Part of it is just trying to figure out how you work through self-interest. You know, and many of these local governments don't have the capacity. And I'm actually working with the Mon Valley, which is a very depressed area outside of the city of Pittsburgh. I'm working with a number of those local governments with the idea of having one economic development organization that would represent a half a dozen or more communities, because they don't have the resources. We've already funded an organization that's focused on tax delinquent properties and how to get them through the system and get control so that they can be put back into commerce. And that is a multi-jurisdictional. So we're trying to build a structure. The little towns still exist, but the structure they need to be proactive and sort of be able to make these kind of choices don't exist, and we're trying to figure out what the scale is to build that. The county has been very helpful. Allegheny County has been very helpful with that. Yes?
You said that 60% of the parcels were tax delinquent in certain areas?
In East Liberty, right.
In East Liberty. Did you have something you're saying about Des Moines as well? Did you have like a land bank, or how did you get?
We had, and this existed long before I was mayor, an urban redevelopment authority. It was very sophisticated, and we were able to change the state law, though. We had to change the state law. Typically, when somebody doesn't pay their taxes for 2 years, you can begin to move to take the property. And understand, we dramatically increased. Maybe the city was pursuing on what we call a treasurer sale, 200 units a year. We went to 2,000 units a year. Not because we wanted it necessarily. So the first places we would look for tax delinquencies are the very healthy neighborhoods, because we wanted to know what was going on. You know, was the house abandoned because somebody died and there are no heirs? Is it a divorce? Is there an elderly person that can't afford taxes? So we would want to know what's going on, but we didn't want that house to begin to blight that neighborhood. And then we would start taking houses that we'd work with neighborhood groups, and we would take them, and we changed the law that would give us the power not to have to bid against speculators, but that we could direct the property into the redevelopment authority. Now, you can do that with land banks too. We directed it into the redevelopment authority, so we didn't need to bid on it, and we could get it for, if there was a lien or something on it, to clear the title, and then we could then make a decision whether we're going to tear it down. If it's a historic house, we would try to preserve it. We'd work with neighborhood groups to give it to them. They were rehabbing houses. So it shaped a whole strategy. In some places, you know, the houses we were going to put together, several acres to do a development. And so it really began, we have 90 neighborhoods in Pittsburgh, so it would be like all your little communities. And so each of our neighborhoods we had a strategy for, of sort of our level of intervention and how we were going to begin to create value. And then we would, to confuse you more, we would tie investments to these houses. So we would do what we called a deferred second mortgage. We were really focused on home ownership, and so the banks were great partners. We would say, work with the developer, we're going to build this house, it's going to cost me $100,000 to build the house, but I think I can only sell it for $60,000 in this neighborhood. So if somebody's going to buy the house, they qualify for a mortgage for $60,000, they go to a bank, get this mortgage, their cost is probably $400 a month. We hold the second $40,000 on a second mortgage. The people don't need to pay us when they sell the house. If they sell it for over $60,000, we split it dollar for dollar for them. So that was encouraging people to buy a house in a neighborhood where they might not have thought of buying a house, but they could buy it at a relatively low mortgage. So that was a very successful program. So we shaped lots with developers, with the bank, lots of different ways to get neighborhoods that were blighted, thinking about what is the scale that will turn that around of intervention that we would do with private developers that would get people to be interested in wanting to live in that neighborhood. Yes, sir.
You clearly have a willingness to tick people off in this process, right? And I was struck by your expression, well, we'll work with you, we work with you. Now that kind of working with you, at least from the greater public perception, is kind of behind closed doors. Even if you allow everybody to come to the meeting, most people don't. So, what are you doing in this particular area? And people of good faith can start out and saying, well, you want to put a park there by the river, but this is some land I was hoping to turn into something that was going to make me a lot of money. And so there's a conflict that's going on there. You get the environmentalists, who I love, and you get the people who want to develop stuff, and sometimes I love them, and it's very easy for them to end up hating one another or feeling that the other side is the enemy, not part of the community. So you see where I'm going here? And so when you're developing a central part of Pittsburgh, somebody who lives up the hill says, hey, how come the city isn't coming up here and cleaning up my roads in that process? How do you get everybody to...
You got to be ready to...
You just have to let them...
You got to be willing to run over some people.
Okay.
I mean, if you want consensus and 100% consensus, you know what? God bless you. I don't have the patience for it. It's not going to happen, okay? I'll give you two quick examples. We buy that steel mill site. There's a long, narrow piece of property there. The river's on one side, an active railroad side is on the other side, and we're going to put a trail. I mean, part of the deal for me, it was a principle, was anytime we get access to the waterfront, it's going to be a public park. No conversation. So the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center, which is the largest employer by far in the city of Pittsburgh, 20,000 people, and the Pittsburgh Steelers, up there with God, they had won the Super Bowl, come to us and say, we want to build a world-class sports medicine facility, a headquarters for the Steelers, practice fields for the University of Pittsburgh and the Pittsburgh Steelers. We say, great, we'll work with you. Their architect comes back with some drawings, and they've taken out the riverfront park. They want their buildings with a view up and down the river, on the river, and so Dan Rooney was then the president of the Steelers, and Jeff Rumoff is still the head of URA, and I always remember this. We go to the Duquesne Club, which is a fancy club in Pittsburgh, and to meet about this, and the poor waiter had to come over and ask us if we could keep it down because we were yelling at each other, right? And so if you go there today, you'll see that's there, but the park is there. And Dan Rooney's big objection was that if you make me build that park and not put my fields in, I can only build 4 80-yard football practice fields. So when the Steelers can't score when they're in the red zone, now you know, right? Now you know. True story, there are 4 80-yard practice fields there, but the park is there. And so a couple years later, Dan's office at the corner office, he's there one evening, he calls me up. It's a nice summer evening. The trail's packed with families and old people and everything. And he calls me up and said, you know what, we did the right thing, didn't we? That's the challenge. I mean, is you need to stand for something. You can't be reactive. You need to go after what you want. The other one I'll tell you about is we proposed to build a baseball park, a football stadium, and a convention center. And we proposed, I mean, we're a flat broke city, right? We proposed to build all three of them at the same time. It's $1.2 billion. And we proposed raising the sales tax 0.5%. And we voted on it, and 70% of the people voted against it. And so a month later, I stood up and said, you know what, we're going to build these anyhow and figure out how to do it without having to do another referendum. And so we built them. You know, I won 2 elections after that, and they were closer. And, you know, and just a couple months ago, there was a big dinner at the, if you've seen Heinz Field, the football field, there's a big glass wall, and there's a big banquet hall there, and they use when there's teams not playing. And there was a big dinner, about 500 people there, and they asked me to come speak. And I said, don't you love this? And it was a beautiful day. It was a luncheon. It was a great view, and everybody clapped and said, so how many of you voted against it? And I mean, I always love to pick a fight, right? And nobody raised their hand, right? And I said, so 70% of you are lying, right? Why would you do that, all right? And that's the challenge. I mean, change is the hard, Machiavelli said it really well a long time ago, change is the hardest thing in the world to do, you know, and we were operating on a sense of urgency. We were really going down the tubes. I mean, we were losing thousands of people, young people. So we didn't feel like we had time to spend a whole lot of time in talking to people and also sort of begging for money from the state or federal government, okay, to make things happen. We made a decision that we were going to reimagine Pittsburgh. And you know, and it ended up okay. I mean, we're a different city. The present mayor and I speak often together, and we stand up and say, you know, we were mayors of 2 different cities. I was a mayor of a city that was failing, and he's trying to manage affordable housing and other issues of a city that's growing. So that's the challenge I think a lot of small towns have, is they're wedded to the status quo, even it's been failing for the last 20 years. And how do they reimagine their city? And it takes courage to do. With that, I'll let you all, yeah, one more, yeah.
You raised the example of the many municipalities in Allegheny County that you're working together with. And you also talked about the role of millennials and how few really want to drive outside of the city in the more suburban municipalities of Pittsburgh. What are some strategies that those communities may be working with to keep their young people, you know, staying in smaller municipalities that are not the city? And how, because I think there may be some parallels to Chester County.
So, I mean, if you would know Pittsburgh, Lawrenceville was a neighborhood in Pittsburgh, right, sort of down by the river, that 15 years ago I could have bought a house for $30,000. And the millennials have discovered it, and now I can't buy a house there for under $300,000. And I used to deliver Meals on Wheels there for 25 years, and so I know all the streets and the alleys, and I mean, I drive there and I can't believe what's happened. Directly across the river is a working class mill town called Millville. That was sort of a dying town. And now it's becoming an interesting place because I can still buy a house over there cheap for $50,000 maybe, right? And it's just 5 minutes across the river, and I have the river there, and I can boat and do things there, and there's a continuous bike trail now, or park that I can go in. And so that has the same assets, but I can buy a house for, you know, much cheaper there. And Millville, the leadership of that has understood that, and so they are getting property and making it available, tax delinquent property. Some of the old houses, they've wrapped around it a sort of a low income, a low interest affordable loan for rehab. So I think there's initiatives like that. I think it's part of it is talking about. I mean, Millville's made a decision to talk about themselves in another way. I'm working on the other end of the city with some communities, and you know what? They're having a hard time changing or even imagining that this could happen in their city, right? Why would I mean, these are these are their community, Rankin Borough, it's 2,500 people, and they say, well, why would anybody want to live here? These are the leaders, right? You probably hear that, right? And that's the challenge, is that you got, for us it was a challenge to reimagine Pittsburgh. Who would want to do something on this old steel mill site that had been sitting there vacant for 20 years? That's hard to do. It's harder to implement.
Thank you.
You have a wonderful evening. Thank you.